Welcome to Punch Keys Podcast. I'm Poppy Minix, your co-host, bringing you blunt talk for the fiction novelist.
And I'm Cascade, your other writerly co-host. If you love to ramble about writing and need a tribe, you found us.
Are you ready? We're uncorking now. Let's talk about punching those keys.
It is the best time of the week. You are welcome, and welcome to Punch Keys.
Yay!
We are here today, and we are talking about what we do every time we talk to you. Dialogue!
Yay for dialogue! Woo!
Dialogue's a really under-noticed tool.
Yes.
Like, it's this thing, we always look at plot and characters and setting and
voice.
Right, your character voice, but we don't look specifically at dialogue and how that needs to end. Well, I wouldn't say we don't, but I don't think it's as big of a topic as it should be a lot of times.
Yeah. Yes.
So we're going to babble to you for however long about dialogue. You're welcome.
Yay!
Are you feeling as excited as Poppy sounded?
Woo! Yeah. All right, I have to be more excited. Sorry. I love-hate dialogue. I hate it so hard.
Wait a minute. What do you hate about it? You love dialogue.
It's really hard sometimes. It's like some of your biggest thoughts and some of your biggest witty banter moments you have to nail those moments. And sometimes it's just like, oh, man, for me as a writer, when I'm writing it, there's sometimes where, when you're talking to somebody and you just wish you had that comeback, but you don't think about it until like an hour later. Writing dialogue is kind of like that for me sometimes. I'm like, okay, oh my gosh, that was a really great line. What are they going to respond with? Or something good. That's right. It's going to be something good. And then you're like, oh crap, I got to move on. And so like, I really get stuck sometimes on dialogue because I'm like, this has to be awesome. And it's just not coming to me.
It really sucks. My characters are smarter and funnier than I am.
I love it when mine are smarter and funnier than I am. I just wish they would do it faster sometimes because I'm like ahead. I'm like, let's go to the next chapter. I'm like, wait, you didn't say anything for that dialogue. You didn't have a response. Crap. And so I have to figure out where that goes. And it can be very frustrating to have to go back so many times to figure out how to exactly to tweak it to perfection. Because, there's no such thing as perfection, but dialogue, pretty darn close.
And dialogue really sticks out. And it's because we do that. We all have that. We replay the conversation in our head, or I should have said this. Or I don't know if you guys, but I do this a lot where I'm like, if someone said this to me, I would totally say this.
I do that too.
And so like I have this imaginary conversation in my head that goes on forever that's never happened. No one's ever said that to me. And it's like, and it's really great stuff. And it's just in my head. So dialogue is a perfect place for us to put those crazy voices. First and foremost, though, I did want to mention your dialogue will always be read smoother if you understand punctuation for it. So although we're going to later talk about how we want you to break rules with the actual dialogue, the punctuation for the dialogue should be right.
Yes.
It should be good because then your dialogue can be broken to do character voice, but your punctuation is for the reader to follow the story and understand it easily without having to stop and pause. And since neither of us have an English degree, we are going to, in the description of the episode, there's a blog I found, the editor's blog. And there's two particular blog posts they had that were great. One was just about actual punctuation, how to do it for action tags, for dialogue tags, for all the different ways to punctuate dialogue. And then there was another post that was about how to do punctuation for dialogue interruptions, which is super important because...
So important. It happens a lot.
Right? People get interrupted all the time. Not just by other people, but by things happening and the
lightning,
scene.
A car running by, the door slamming. Yes, stuff happens where it just snaps your conversation in two, and you need to know how to punctuate that to make sure that you get that clearly across.
So it's great to play with voice and flavor. Your punctuation, though, that's not where you play with voice and flavor. It's not. So we'll put those links up, so go ahead and check those out. I actually was reading through them and was like, oh, I need to make sure I need to go
review those a whole lot.
Yeah, that's something like you review all the time. I don't care how long you've been writing. You always go back and review that stuff. And I always find myself, when I'm going through editing, I'm like, I know this. why did I flub this up? Especially with dialogue punctuation. I'm like, okay, it's a dialogue tag. It should be a comma, not a period. I know this.
Yes.
I know this.
And yet those periods sneak right in. I know.
Yeah.
I know.
So it's always good to basically freshen up on that if you know it. And if you don't know it, welcome to the never-ending journey of constantly refreshing up on it.
Truth.
Okay, so we're mentioning action tags versus dialogue tags, which Poppy's going to want to talk about. No tags.
No tags.
She likes it naked.
No, I don't. I have a hard time making it naked, and I should. Oh, man.
Poppy wants to get naked more often.
I do. Wait, what?
If it makes you feel good,
I don't know what's happening right now.
Whatever you need, I'm not here to judge.
We're talking about dialogue. Dialogue! Awkward moment.
Okay, action tags, dialogue tags, nakedness. So here's the difference between them. Your action tag is when, instead of saying he said, she said, your character is actually doing something. They are going and getting the cup out of the counter. They are dodging the bullet. They are bleeding profusely onto the steps. Whatever it is they're doing, they are performing an action. And so saying Meredith is pumping all of her blood out onto the steps is sufficient enough. You don't need to say Meredith said.
Right.
Right. So, and sometimes you can say Meredith said. And sometimes you can just have her say, oh shit.
Right.
You don't even have to say the blood's pumping out because the bullet just went into her. And we know she's on the steps. We know it's her saying it.
Yeah.
Right? Sure. So when do you know when to use which?
That's my giant, huge sigh of, oh man. This is always a tough one for me. I've gotten way better at using tags. I've gotten better at using action, far better at using action. And then sometimes using internal dialogue as well, just to break things up. I still have a super hard time not tagging or actioning anything, which I need to learn how to do better. But it's just the flow of conversation. So when you're having a conversation, obviously, if you're speaking to another person, it's like, Meredith said this. I said this. Meredith said this. That is not very exciting. And just placing in a synonym isn't going to help you. They don't need to articulate, to pronounce, to hypothesize, to utter. They just need to said, because your brain has the ability to just sort of get rid of saids. They don't really matter. Say, said, anything like that just sort of goes away. It kind of blends in unless you're saying it over and over and over again, which is why we have action and which is why we have other things to do besides that.
But I really want to highlight that point. So if you say, Christina said is invisible.
It
as
is.
Where if she coughed it, if she sighed it, if she growled it, if she... all of a sudden it's not invisible and that sticks out. So you have to watch if they're constantly sighing things, if they're constantly growling things, if you have a repeat of an action tag too, constantly rolling their eyes, then it sticks out and it becomes this tick. Yep. Like when you see someone who blinks their eyes too much.
Yes.
When they're talking to you and you get distracted sometimes what they're saying because they're blinking their eyes a lot because you're not used to it. It can become a distraction from the story. It can become a distraction of the actual dialogue. Your lack of just using said can become a tick. Just using said, there's just this balance in everything, guys.
There is a balance. And we talk about repetition in a past episode, and it is exactly like that as well. If you keep saying said, it's going to stand out. Whereas if you just drop it in occasionally, no one's going to notice or care. They're still going to be just dove into your dialogue and it's going to be fine. But actually having it out, said, it's like, oh, okay, now it's everywhere and now I notice it. So using things in balance is super important, and being able to also kind of set a scene at the same time, but not too much. It's always a balance with writing, I swear. So being able to have an action tag, but not being like, oh, I paused the conversation to stare at the stained glass windows because they reminded me of my mother, because my mother loved stained glass and she was religious and she went to church and she took me with her. And I remember these days and blue backstory stuff, info dump, blah. And then who the heck knows what you were talking about in the conversation anymore? That's gone. So you have to bring it back. I'm notorious for that sometimes. So just trying to figure out how to balance it and have it make sense.
We were talking about this before the episode, and Poppy actually said something that I think really is going to help define when to use it. And it's about the pacing. And the pacing is identifying what kind of scene you have.
Yes.
So if you have a slower scene that is setting up before the action, it's like the beginning building blocks before the action. So your scenes, your chapters, your acts. So if you're breaking your book into like 3 acts, 4 acts, 5 acts, whatever, in the beginning, you're like building, setting everything up. You're like building this climax, right? So scenes that have more intense inner dialogue, longer conversations, longer action tags and things happening, it's going to make sense. The no tags, I think, are going to be like when you're at the peak for an action happening.
Yep.
So look at where you're at in that. Are you building towards an action? Are you just starting in that build, or are you like right before it? And that's going to determine how much backstory you need to be giving, how much scene setting you should be giving, how much inner dialogue you should be giving. I think once the action hits, you should have already set the scene. You shouldn't be setting the scene in the middle of action. Even if it's action tags in dialogue, those don't go there. In like a high tense setting, you need the no tags, the nakedness. You need to run around naked like Poppy in your action scenes. Or you need to do an occasional dialogue tag.
Yes.
And then when you're building the scene and when you're climaxing down from it and seeing the consequences from it, then you start going heavier into the action tags. Then you start going heavier into the setting reveals, to the inner dialogue and thought and contemplating what's happened. So the type of scene you're dealing with is going to dictate how heavily you lean on each of these tools.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pacing is the key.
Gosh, pacing is so much the key. It's like such a difference between if they're sitting under a tree at sunset and just having a conversation as to they're running through an alleyway in the dark and they only have time to say a couple words. And it's just, man, there's just such a difference between it, and having the setup between the two is fascinating. It's just such a big thing with pacing.
And if there's something that you find you're like, oh, I need them, this information has to happen, and it doesn't fit here because the pacing is super fast. They're just found out that someone's tailing them and they're being stalked. And so they can't really stop and think about this, but I really need this information. That's when you go back a few scenes earlier and you find a place to backload it in there.
I like that.
And it can be an inner dialogue. It can be an action tags. It can be all the different ways. And that goes back to the episode 2 we're talking about with layering your scenes. And foreshadowing the information that your later scenes need to make sense. You should definitely layer in those scenes that are in the beginning of that arc and build, for sure. But we're talking about dialogue. So
we are, yeah.
that's dialogue.
But that's smart. And that's also like second draft material too. So when you're just doing your first draft, just throwing it all out there, you know, you don't need to nail your dialogue first. It's in edits where you're like staring at it going, why won't you work? And like smacking it into place and making sure that everything makes sense and that the pacing is correct.
One of my favorite things about first drafting dialogue is the fact that dialogue is totally allowed to break all the rules.
Oh my gosh, that is the best part about dialogue. It's like all those rules that you had to learn with writing and that you've learned along the way where, you know, there's very specific things that you can and cannot do. You can just take those and just throw them out the window. It's all good, you know, because people speak the way they do. You can drop words, you can curse, throw it all out there. I love it.
It is awesome. So there's a couple guidelines I think that are good, though, in how to break the rules. I know that's so anti-rebel. I'm going to give you rules on how to break the rules.
Right.
Sorry. I'm not sorry. I don't know.
That's great.
One is, like everything else, consistency. So if your character's outer dialogue is breaking a rule, make sure they're consistently breaking that same rule in their outer dialogue. And it's okay if they only do it in their outer dialogue and not in all of their inner dialogue if you're in that point of view or whatever, because then it might become annoying to the reader. So just showing it in the outer dialogue is a really great tool. My other big one is that you don't need to call the other character by their first name a bazillion times.
Man. Yeah, we talked about this before. And like different voices and stuff, and how people don't typically call other people by their name. They do sometimes.
I do, but I'm a weirdo.
Depends on who you are.
Yeah.
I do not. Yeah, we were talking about this, like, I don't think I've called my husband by his actual name maybe like twice in our marriage. We've been married for like 2 decades. So
that's where
like,
I do it quite frequently to the point where my husband will turn to me and be like, yes, Cassandra? How can I help you? And because he's like calling me out on my weird formality and calling him by his first name, I don't even know.
Fantastic. And that is a fantastic voice thing between your characters, but it's not
But be consistent
typical.
in that. So
Be
like if
consistent,
you're the character
yes.
who does that, then they're always going to do that.
And
but
not
that
all of them
doesn't
are gonna
mean
do that.
any of your other characters should do that. That tick should
Exactly.
be for that character and that character alone.
Yeah. That's a pretty hefty tick right there. It is. It's one of those that stands
You're
out.
welcome.
Because I would look at it and be like, oh, and then I would read everybody else and be like, oh, it's just them. I love this, because there's just, it makes everything stand out. I think that's fantastic. I had a friend who wouldn't call her mom, and she would always say it very specifically. She'd be like, mother, like every single time. And she put it on every single sentence. If there was a conversation with her mom, she'd be like, oh, so you're back early, mother. And I'd be like, it was just like and it was just such a quirky, weird trait. But that is something that people just don't do except for her. So, make these different and unique and interesting.
Mother is one of those words. Mother and father, grandparents and aunts and uncles. I think how you refer to them, it can be a cultural thing too, but it can also just be a personality quirk.
Yep.
But everyone, like how they address their parents says so much about them. That's just
Yes.
people in general. Characters so much so. And there's so much you can reveal to your reader in how they address their parents without having to tell them how they feel, just by their verbal addressment to them.
Yes.
Is addressment a word? It is now.
It is now. Great job. You did it. It's going in the dictionary. Yeah, if they don't call their dad, instead they use their very first name, you probably are going to guess that unless it's a joke, they are not very fond of their dad and they never consider that person a father figure. So there's a whole lot you can reveal with certain dialogue things that you put in there, which I totally love. I love like the purpose of everything. It's just fascinating.
It is. And it's my favorite is, as we're going in and doing this, is finding the different voice between each one.
Yeah.
So like we were saying before, it's everyone has a different education background. Everyone has a different family background. So even if you take everyone in the family, we all have particular
Dialect.
Yeah. So there's
Yeah.
a book actually that I want to talk about that I think is really good with this. It's Cemetery Boys by Aidan Thomas, and they do fantastic with it. So the book is the dialogue tags and how the characters refer to each other reveals so much. The lead character is transgender, and some characters are accepting of that, and some are accepting but bungling it.
Yeah.
Through their acceptance. But there's also the factor where there's a cultural thing that's being introduced. And so it's set in a society where it's very heavily influenced by culture from Mexico. And so there's just words that they use. There's references to aunts and uncles, to grandparents, to how you speak to them, how you hold your tongue, what things are polite to say, what aren't. A lot of times they'll say with dialogue, cut the how's the weather talk, that has no purpose. But sometimes your dialogue can have the purpose of revealing relationship ties between people, revealing culture, revealing things about the character themselves. And even though it's not furthering the plot, that is revealing stuff that makes the plot so much better.
I completely agree. It should be purposeful.
Yeah, it should be entirely purposeful. Gosh, I have like a whole thing here with purpose and dialogue. It's because it's the plot. So I definitely want to have it like furthering the plot, right? But furthering the scene, and furthering the scene is different than furthering the world building, right? So you're building the world and the culture and beliefs that they have, and then you're furthering the characters' thoughts by what they say out loud, even by what they don't say out loud. And then you're also furthering, there's so many dynamics you can show between two characters speaking. And it can be romantic, it can be parent-child, it can be adversaries, it can be best friends, it can be cousins, whatever it is. How they speak to each other and their action beats in between that's when action beats are really, really awesome, because the action beats can contradict or support the dialogue, and it tells you 1,000 things about the relationship between these two that you don't have to then tell. That's how you show.
Yes.
Which is really cool.
I love that a lot. I love the purpose of it and I love multitasking dialogue too. Something that shows that the character is sarcastic and also gives world building that says the world doesn't allow sarcastic people in it or something, like there's just so much between dialogue that you can do and making sure that it isn't just plain. If you go into a coffee shop and you're listening to conversations, you really don't care about all the hellos unless they're unique and super fun. You really want to get to the beef of what the heck is going on. Like what's the gossip? What's the conflict? Who's doing what? Why are they mad? Like, oh, this is fascinating. Like you want the beef of it all. You want to speed up through their conversation, just overhearing and eavesdropping. Why would your reader want to listen to highs and common conversation? We can hear that anywhere. We want to hear the unique. We want to hear the interesting. We want to hear the conflict. We want to hear what the heck is going on that's making the world just, that's the stuff we really want to be a fly on the wall for and we want to hone into.
Right. I mean, I get so bored hearing people talk about the weather or I'm notorious. Like, I'm the worst shopper in the world. I go through when I'm getting my groceries checked out and the clerk wants to talk to me about my groceries and what I found in the store.
Oh, the extrovert small talk. I get you. I'm the extrovert with the small talk.
Or not. Yep. Or the weather that's coming in. And I'm just like,
why are you talking?
You would probably ring my groceries faster if you'd stop talking.
Right.
Like, that's what I want to say, but instead I'm just like, oh, I'm like, I'm a horrible person, guys.
No, you're an introvert, which is totally understandable. Introverts do not do like that weather talk. Well, an introvert when you're writing.
I can switch back and forth between introvert and extrovert. I do not switch into extrovert for weather talk or for grocery talk.
Sure. You want purposeful conversation.
I think that's magnified by 10 when I'm in a book.
I could see that completely. Yes.
I think people who are extroverts are and love weather, grocery talk, aren't going to love it as much in a book and a story.
I completely agree with you on that as well, because I am an extrovert and I will have just common conversations with pretty much anybody ever. But
I don't even know how that happens.
But if that goes into a book, it's because there's a purpose behind it. It's because when my dad asks about the weather, I know he's asking if everything's okay. And this is the normalcy of our conversation. It's not because we're literally talking about the weather. We're not talking about the weather. It's all in context. We're making sure everything's okay by saying it like this.
That's a beautiful literary conversation. And what's going to make that is your inner dialogue throughout it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like, that becomes really cool, and that shows a lot about you and your dad. Mm-hmm. Which is why people attach to characters. Because then they get to experience those little moments, and they get glimpses, and they see. And that's what dialogue does. Those conversations and connections between people. You have to show them the connection. You can't show them the stupid fluff. No one connects to that. You have to show them the actual conversation that means something. That means something to one, if not both of the people there. And it's even better if they both have conflicting goals in that conversation.
Completely. That is the best.
Yeah.
And if you do have common conversation, because, people have common conversation, right? And if you're trying to make it real, you're going to say hi to people. And yes, you can skip that part. But sometimes it stands out if you do it too much, where it's like, well, did they even say hi? They're just going into a conversation. But so sometimes you can say it in a unique way, because sometimes people do. They're not just saying hi. Maybe they say something completely ridiculous, and that's how they say hello. So trying to make it unique and different, where it's not a common conversation anymore, is also kind of a unique way, as long as you're consistent with it in your characters.
You can also use those introductions as a transition. So sometimes you can have dialogue that happens that you don't actually have to give. So you can be like, oh, I gave a head nod as he walked over. Or you can be like, oh, after we did the pleasantries back and forth about the weather in our classes.
Yes, exactly that.
Finally, we got to what we really wanted to talk about.
Right. Now we're at the beef of it. Hooray.
That line right there tells you everything you need to do. And it's actually a transition. If you're transitioning from the boy walking down the hall past the lockers to the other boy to talk to them, and they're so fluttered and excited.
Right.
You've bypassed, well, actually, if they're fluttered and excited, you probably want those initial words.
But I mean, you can still cut that down to like a sentence or two, if that.
Yeah, because the meat of the conversation is where it really gets good. And so it's not that you cut out all of the small talk. It's you refer to it or hint at it.
Right.
But you don't actually give it.
Yeah, because it's just not important stuff that you don't need to say, hey, well, oh my gosh, hi, how are you? Oh, I am great. Are you doing okay? I'm good. And you're probably bored already just listening to me in 3 seconds. I am bored even saying it. So, we do this and we all do this to people. It's not like this is uncommon conversation, but that's the point. When we're reading, we want it to be exciting and different, and we want to be captivated. We want a story. We don't want to just have it be every single day. We already live every single day. We want to fall into a story that's not our life. We want to fall into somebody else's story. And with that comes all this unique dialogue.
Dialogue's also really great at revealing backstory and clues for your plot.
Gosh, I use that a lot.
It's super tricky in how you do it. Because if you don't do it in a natural way that fits, guys, info dumping and dialogue is still info dumping.
It is. And especially if it's unnatural, because if somebody's just spilling like the entire past life story, that's not fun to read. It's like, oh, you just gave everything right there. That was something.
Well, I'm gonna, I think something needed me over there.
Right.
Right now. I'm gonna go see what it is.
Yes. Gotta go that way, because bye. Yes, exactly that.
So I think good ways to catch that are if you see, I know we've talked about before the villain monologue, that you want to avoid it. I'm just going to say you should avoid regular monologues in general at this point. So if you have like this giant chunk of dialogue that's like a quarter of your page, it better be really, really important. It's really rare that someone talks that long without being interrupted by something.
Unless they're giving like a speech. Yeah.
Or not even even interrupted like with their own actions and their own inner thoughts.
That's true. Because you're thinking as you're speaking at the same time.
Yeah, and you're probably observing how other people are reacting to what you're saying, even if they're not actually replying.
I agree.
So there's so many ways to break this up. As beautiful as a writer as Shakespeare was, I don't think I would recommend that fourth wall monologue break as often as he used it. Yeah, I just wouldn't personally, but that's me.
Yes.
And then other things too, like if you're revealing a bunch of backstory or information that isn't relevant to the conversation, but it is relevant to the plot, find a different spot for it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh, but it's a natural, they were just talking about how much they loved their chocolate milkshakes. And I really need to get information about the specific cocoa bean factory. Sure, you can make that link up, but they're going to kind of have to ramble and talk for a while. And they weren't talking about cocoa beans. They weren't talking about, they were just saying the chocolate shake tasted good at the diner they were at.
Right.
And so then you're going to have to completely pause the scene, and for your character to talk about, oh, well, it's good because of, I don't know, the cocoa beans and the development and my father works there and our whole family. That's just a lot of information. Is there other ways to show some of this stuff, or do you need to deliver it all right there?
Yeah. Or can you recap it if it's really something that you need? And then we had this conversation about that yesterday, and I keep thinking back on it and, something, but not making it where it's just one giant bill of information.
One giant monologue.
Ugh, one giant monologue. Yeah, that's tough.
Avoid those.
That's tough because you want to deliver the information, but you also don't want it to be like, this is exactly on the nose. I think that's the biggest problem sometimes with dialogue, is that it's just, there are some times where there's something you want to say, but people don't typically say exactly what they want to say. They say something a little bit different, and it can be very boring for a reader to be like, oh, she just said who the killer was because she had this backstory on this thing and all this stuff. And this is how she really feels about everything. And now she's really hurt because of this. And she's really scared because of this person. And here's everything because she just blurted it all out. And it's like, okay, well, let's break that down. Let's make it not quite as telling. And let's kind of show it a little bit more. Show versus tell doesn't just stick to actions. It actually goes into dialogue as well, where you need to be able to hint and let it ride and let the reader figure it out on their own instead of just being like, and this is exactly how she felt. Doop, doop, doop. So
that's awesome advice. I completely agree with that. The other thing that we had on the list that we wanted to talk about was accents.
Accents. Gosh, that's a fun one.
Accents are tough. What's your rule for that?
Oh, do I have a rule for that yet? I'm still learning on accents. I do not write in accents unless it's very briefly and then that falls away, because I think it's too distracting to the reader, they have to stop and pause and reread and be like, why is there extra letters in there? Or for whatever reason, if you start it out, I mean, I've seen it happen multiple times where people just say it, or like they're like, oh, this accent has additional S's, or whatever, has more R's. They roll their R's. Cool. Everybody knows what a rolled R means. It doesn't mean you did put in 4 R's. And doing it through the whole entire thing can be distracting, but you also need to be consistent too. So honestly, I don't really know what the answer to that is. Do you? I mean, what's your rules? What have you come across?
Well, I have some rules, but I'm going to repeat the same recommendation. Cemetery Boys. Mm-hmm. So because they go in with the dialogue there's actually a difference in, oh, my aunt rolls her R's as though she's this other type of culture from this other place. We don't really roll them that much or whatever. Yeah. There's stuff like that reminds me that there's an accent happening, and there's certain titles, and then every once in a while, I like to call them flavor words. So this is kind of a thing for me. So instead of doing like a full accent, I noticed it here, I've noticed it in lots of other books, where you do flavor words that are thrown in. So whether it's like a flavor word of a type of swearing or a metaphor they use, or if it's actually just using a word in a different language and just using that one word there where you can tell by context what that word means, even if you don't speak the language.
Yes.
Those are flavor words that remind you the character speaks an accent without me having to. It's almost like me trying to read algebra, trying to read an accent sometimes.
Yep.
Where I just don't get it right, because I'm not as traveled and as experienced as I really wish I was, that I can hear all of these naturally. It's a little bit harder for me. So if the author can tell me, and introducing the character, if they can just flat out say what accent they speak.
Yes.
I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Just flat out say the accent, and then remind me when they notice the extra R roll, or when they use the flavor word, or when they use the way to describe something or a title to someone that matters to them.
Right.
Like, oh, that's right. You are from the culture that uses this word, or from the type of demographic that uses this, or you're just really freaking awesome and you use rainbows and glitter and everything you talk about. I don't know. Whatever it is. But yes. I remember, oh, that's your voice. That's you.
Yeah.
So there's like these little reminder flags that stick up throughout the dialogue.
I agree with you on that.
Oh, here's a reminder flag of who it is speaking and how they sound.
Oh, yay.
Well, there it is.
Yes, exactly that. That's smart.
And all the stuff I've read recently, Cemetery Boys does that the best.
That's awesome. I like that. Yeah, I've had to do that a lot in the work I have that's publishing soon, because there's so many different accents in there, and I had to do a lot of studying on what makes an accent. Like,
that's Holiday Hotel, right?
Holiday Hotel, yeah.
Yeah, that's already on pre-sale for anyone who's interested.
It is. And I had to go and study, because I haven't been to many other countries. I've met lots of people from different places and stuff, but I couldn't tell you just by talking to them what makes the accent. And so I had to go and listen to some YouTube videos, and I had to go and research and be like, what makes the Danish accent a Danish accent? And it would be like, oh, well, sometimes they miss their R's, or they really accentuate their H's and stuff like that. And so I have my character say that, oh, he's European of some kind. I can't name it because I don't know it, but he misses like half of his R's. And so I'm hoping that sort of,
I think that's the perfect way to do
goes
it.
in. Yeah, and I don't say it. I mean, I don't like write it out as to what's happening. Like, he's not missing his R's, because I feel like that would stop the conversation potentially. But I've seen people who do that, and I think that works, but it takes me a second to kind of look at it and be like, oh, okay, that's how the accent is. And sometimes, I don't know, I like both. I think it just depends, but as long as you're consistent about it.
Consistency is the golden egg.
Consistency, gosh, it really is. It's like, and then reminding, because he speaks Danish sometimes, so he'll just pop in with a Danish conversation occasionally. He'll just say something in Danish, and I'm like, okay, cool. Like, hopefully that's enough reminder that there is an accent there, and it's not just speaking American,
I just have to say this. So I've read this book that she's talking about with the Danish. His sneaky Danish that he sneaks in sometimes is totally during Sex and Times, when he's just rocking her world. It is the hottest thing ever, guys. It's really good. So
I'm so glad.
That was well
But
planned.
yeah, I had that, and I had French in there. I just was like, let's just throw in all kinds of languages, and I had Spanish in there as well because it's in the Caribbean, and in the Caribbean you just get it's beautiful melting pot of all kinds of different nationalities, and it's just fascinating to me that so many people can be in a small area that have so many different accents, and I wanted to say that. And so yeah, it's in having to study what those accents are and how to say them, and oh, she has a Parisian accent, which is totally different from a French accent, and it's just I don't know if many people will know what a Parisian accent sounds like, but
I feel like that's
it's noted.
The fun of a reader is they get to be in this new world and they get to learn different types of people and different types of everything. And dialogue is a way to show that.
Gosh, it is. And that is just really, really fun with the dialogue, is being able to separate that out and have different structures on each person and the way that they say things. And we talked about it in character voice before. But yeah, the way that even stuff that comes out in dialogue as people's dialect and the way that they use the words that they use, the way that they set up the words that they use. Do they say, hey, are you going over there? Or do they say, hey, you going? Or you going, or you go. I mean, it's like there's so many different ways that people say things. As long as you're consistent with that character's voice, it's really fun to read. And it is like such a pride moment for me, and my heart just expands and swells when somebody reads a line and says, I know who that is. I'm like, yay! Like I passed, I successed, yay! A successful moment right there, because it's like when you can have your character stand out solely because of a sentence, and they're like, oh, I know who that character is. It's
I think that's like an unspoken game in our writing group.
It is an unspoken game in our writing group. It's like, oh my God, is that this person? And it's like,
because we do sprinting together. Every day we all sprint together and we share last lines. And a lot of times the last line doesn't have a dialogue tag, or it has an action tag, or it has and a lot of times a name of who's saying it is just a he or a she. There's not an actual name. And pretty much all of us in there have multiple works, have multiple characters. And a lot of times we know what each other's working on at that time. But there's some of us that are a little bit of a ferret, perhaps.
What? Are you talking about me? I don't know what you're talking about.
Around to multiple projects and within a 5-minute period.
Maniac? That would be me. Yeah, that's me.
But it's really fun. I find it's really fun whenever there's like 10 of us in there.
Yes.
And so we'll post a last line and be like, without it, be like, oh, I so love so-and-so's voice. You nail it every time. And they're like, oh, I'm so glad you love it. I'm on my side of my screen, but like, oh yeah, I nailed it. I got the right name.
Happy dance. Yeah, it's like the best.
I know your character. So I hope they're dancing, but I know their character too.
Exactly. That is the best, when you can just pinpoint, because you know what that character would say. Like once you get in them and once you like understand, once you're reading and you are really invested in that character, like you just know, like anybody. It wouldn't matter if I have friends who will text me and I'm like, I know who this is. It wouldn't matter if their name was there or not. I know that this is the conversation they would have, because this is exactly the thing that they would say. It's either highly sarcastic, or it's just, there's something that just tags them as it being from them, or it starts out and it's just like no entry at all. It's just like, yeah, okay, so this happened, or whatever, mid-thought. I love mid-thought people. I'm a mid-thought person. My husband dings me on that all the time. He's like, I literally have no idea what you're talking about. You literally just came in like, hey, I was in your brain. I'm like, yeah, I do that sometimes. Sorry. So it's just a thing. So, but I'm consistent with it still. So 20 years later, he's still like, I don't know what you're saying. You need to back up like 4 lines. I'm like, sorry. Oops.
So, and how endearing and funny and cute is that? So having your characters have those quirks is really fun. The best way to explain them is to have the characters around them call them out on it when they first show them. So then the reader knows, oh, this is a quirk. Oh, they thought it was abnormal too. The character around them pointed it out. Got it. Okay. And then as it keeps showing up, they start snickering.
Yes.
Ideally, we hope.
We hope we can amuse and entertain. That's always the best.
And I think the last thing we really wanted to talk about was the inner and outer log. What is it? Balance and portion.
Yeah.
Like, how do you balance inner and outer dialogue?
I mean, that's a tough one. There's a lot of things on the inside that you're not going to say outside, and both of them can't be common, really. I mean, yes, you can look at the sky and the sunset and appreciate it. Totally understand that. But what's the purpose of it? Is it because it reminds of something? Is it symbolism for something else? But it's not something you're going to say outside. So I have a hard time too sometimes, because when you get into a dialogue moment and you have those inner thoughts, you don't want to get trapped in your inner thought land and then just kind of lose it and be like, wait, what was I talking about? You don't want the reader to have to go back a paragraph or two because that was the last dialogue and they don't know what you're talking about anymore.
I think I found I have to remind myself that my character's not me. So, like, you wouldn't know it since I'm doing a podcast where I blab about my thoughts all the time. I'm very closed off. I don't I'm very masterful in conversations where I make sure they're always about the other person. And then if it's a question that's asked specifically about me, I reroute really well. Because I have the mindset that the more someone knows about me, the more they can use it against me. So I'm like always on a defense. And I have to remind myself when I'm like writing characters, I'm in a conversation and dialogue, that my characters don't have the same issues I do.
Right.
As for, I'm like, oh, don't say anything about yourself. I'm like, my character's not me. Freaking talk about yourself. This character totally would. And then I also I have a character that is like me in that sense, where she is very guarded and hold off. And I found that I had to push myself to do more outer dialogue because the plot needed it. So like, even though I was like, oh, she wouldn't say anything, she'd just keep it all to herself. I'm like, well, how is that an engaging story to read?
You have to make sure it's in your inner, because your reader has to know what's going on in that person's head.
And even if it's the lead point of view.
Yeah.
You have to have the outer dialogue. And I think on the opposite side, if you're a person who just shares everything and talks all the time, and your character is doing a buttload of outer dialogue, I think you have to reel it in a little bit and do more inner dialogue. I think there has to be a good, healthy balance of both. And I don't know if it's just me. I would say if I was looking statistically through my whole manuscript, I'm probably always going to have a little bit more inner dialogue than outer, right?
Yes, I would say the same for me.
Okay. But I should have I want to say like 30%, 40%. I mean, you should have a chunk of dialogue because they have to think things out loud because it gives the characters around them something to react to.
And that is the thing right there, is you rely so much sometimes on the perception of other characters that if that person says nothing ever, okay, that's a perception. We get it. But they're going to have to fill in that conversation too. And they're still going to be saying stuff and going forward with the story to make sure that everything comes out with the antagonist. So it's not just one big monologue and everything comes out with the conflict and everything that's happening. There's just so much deliciousness in, you look at something, I know I brought it up before because I love it, but Castaway was like 70% silence. But he still had conversations with the volleyball. He was alone. He was completely alone for most of the movie.
And that's your action tags, though. So, like, your action tags are actually going to be saying so much there.
You could tell that there was inner things happening. You could tell what was going on. It wasn't something that was lacking by any stretch of the imagination. And there was still dialogue. He still talked to himself. People talk to themselves all the time. So it still comes out, outer, it still comes out where people can overhear it. We're social creatures typically. And even when we're not social creatures, that doesn't mean that we don't talk to ourselves or to our dog or to our coconut, whatever.
And sometimes too, I think I just have to. I found myself where there's some section of inner dialogue that's really great and furthers the plot and the reactions. And I just have to put quotes around it. Even if I'm like, no, that's in their head. If I force it to be outer dialogue, I'm like, all of a sudden the scene just unfolds beautifully. Isn't
that interesting? It's almost like we pay more attention when it's said out loud because it means so much more in a way. You get so much deliciousness on the inside, but what comes out,
I think it's the sometimes reaction from everything around.
And is the reaction from everything around as well. You're right. It's the conflict of it. Because if you're all internal, there's no conflict there. You're not going to fight with yourself. Well, you might fight with yourself a little bit. But you're not going to fight with yourself as much as you're going to fight with somebody else.
My other favorite thing is when the outer dialogue and the inner dialogue are completely opposite.
I love that.
I will 100% do that for you. Inner dialogue says that's never going to happen, but I need to go, and that ends this conversation the quickest.
Right. Like that's what I need right now is for this to stop.
That's the best. That is the absolute best.
Gosh, those are really, really fun.
And it's so real and relatable. And that's what you want as a reader. All those juicy things that we think in our head,
but the gossip.
We don't say out loud. Oh, that stuff's good.
Because all that gossip is so delicious, especially when it's delivered like firsthand. It's like, oh man, that is juicy. It's just like so great to hear you be that fly on the wall and you just want to watch. Because, you know, people are cool. And it's just fun to like see all that unfold.
I agree. Okay, so dialogue. It's dialogue, guys. Have your character speak.
So fun.
Should we do a challenge?
Yeah, of course we should do a challenge. What are you going to do, Cass?
Well, I love flavor words.
Flavor words are wonderful.
Yeah, flavor words that make it so you know what character is talking, that's revealing information about the character, about the world. I want a line of dialogue with your favorite flavor word.
Oh, that's fun. Your character's favorite flavor word. You use it all the time.
Yeah, I love it.
Oh, man. I like that.
So it could be a favorite swear. It could be how they address someone. It could be, I don't know what. Surprise me. Tell me all the ways that a flavor word can be a flavor word. Show me. Show me.
I love it.
Yep.
Gotta bring some Christmas swears into the game.
Oh.
Gonna make up some more my made up words from Cozy.
Oh.
Yes. Those are always fun.
You've got some good ones.
So fun.
All right, guys. Keep punching the keys, doing that dialogue. Reach out, poke us, say hi. We're always on Twitter and Instagram. Please give us a review if you can.
That would be lovely. I would love a review.
If it's a mean review, you can, but I'm okay if you just decide not to if it's a mean one. I'm okay with that. But if you want to leave a nice review.
Honesty is policy. Yes.
You guys are awesome. Keep punching the keys. We will talk to you next time. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. And if you liked this episode, please subscribe and give us that clickable 5-star love.
Got writer questions or feedback? Reach out through our website. And until next time, make sure to punch the keys.